Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Narrative Dive, where we discuss the narratives that dominate our world. I'm Jessica Buchleitner, your resident journalist.
And I'm Angela Natividad, your resident mythologist.
And today we are going to be talking about binary narratives. What are those? They are everywhere, and you don't even know it. So, what are binary narratives? And of course, I mentioned earlier that they are present everywhere in our lives. They are overarching stories that present polarized characters, constructs, ideas, and sides. They are, of course, one of the oldest forms of narratives present in myths, fairy tales, and obviously many religious texts as well, especially the Bible, which I'll get to in a moment. I'm going to give you a few examples of more watered down versions, and then Angela's going to deep dive into some more elaborate stories. Good versus evil. This is definitely a binary narrative because we're taking two polar opposites. Bad guy versus good guy. Obviously, two polarized characters. Boogeyman versus the hero. And as a little hint, our next episode is going to be on a boogeyman narrative. So we're just going to prep you for that now. What is particularly, I guess you could say, alarming about binary narratives is that they are often zero-sum narratives, unless you're reading a more elaborate story where the plot line is more developed and the characters are more developed. In its very simple form, it's a zero-sum. What that means is that there's always a villain, always an evangelist. There's always some polar opposite of some other opposite. So this zero-sum aspect of binary narratives is a problem because it makes us see the world as two extremes, or two only possible solutions, or even one possible solution, depending on how the narrative is structured. These narratives distract us from critical thinking because they present only two polarized scenarios and allow very little room for us to consider anything in between. The problem with this is that they program our brain to assess more limited information over time. When we're hearing too many of these narratives, when we're seeing them in the news and the media is structuring narratives this way, we are continuously being programmed through our social feeds, through our news consumption, through our Netflix, through all of our possible programming. We are being programmed to assess information in a polarized way and less in terms of critical thinking.
To illustrate this nicely, Jessica and I have a common friend who used the example of when you have two different kinds of ants in a glass that are not the same part of the same sort of ant family, like maybe one is a fire ant and maybe another is an earth ant, and they're fine in the glass for a while, even if they're different, and then somebody shakes the glass and they immediately attack each other because they believe that the other one is the reason for their discomfort. Quite often, like what is inspiring me about what Jess is saying is that binary narratives are designed to create that same sort of effect, to create a sense of teams so that there can be a battle of some kind. So it's often helpful when you're faced with a binary situation, and I think that we have lots of situations like this in life where you're literally being asked, you have to choose a side. This happened during COVID. It happens at basically every election now, et cetera. It happens every Thanksgiving over any number of table topics. It's worth asking who might be shaking the glass, who might be benefiting, what group of people might be benefiting from those binary narratives. It might also be that nobody is benefiting from them because the belief that there is an other out there that's actually out to get us is also a binary narrative. It's helpful to think that we have also structured systems that operate in a particular kind of way, advancing certain kinds of worldviews that we are either rewarded or punished for, and that thus defend themselves as systems do. And systems, of course, can include people, but not people who are necessarily acting with intent.
That's a great example, Ange. And if you're taking anything away from this episode, at its simplest form, it would be the ant analogy. That's a really powerful story, and that's a very good point. Also, what is a good point is who's benefiting from this. And I'm about to get to some of those examples. Another issue with binary narratives is that they make us see behaviors as good versus bad, which sort of kills the deeper examination of situational aspects of motivated behavior. One example that I want to give about this, which may sound like it's been out of news headlines for quite a while, is the situation of Somali pirates attacking ships. Now, this was in the news for a while. There were some hostage situations around this. And how I noticed news media reporting on this was in a very binary way. The pirates are the evil, the rescue teams are the good, or the hostages are the good. But what we're missing in the broader context of the story, and what we're not encouraged to understand, is that many of the pirates who are taking over ships are doing so because they are starving, or they don't have access to resources, or they're living under a dictatorship, or their family is dying of a disease. There's a famine going on. There's all of these things happening in the country and the territory where they are in the background that don't make it into the story. So the broader context of what's motivating that behavior is simply missing and isn't there. So we then form this construct in our brain of this group of people is good, this group of people is bad, this group of people is a victim, and so forth. So one of the first ideas within literature and society around binary narratives was started by French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. I say that very German. My apologies to those.
There was a lot of intermixing between those cultures.
There is, exactly. And so also, I mean, to be fair, back in his time, the notion of France and French and Germany and German was completely different than what it is today. Mm-hmm. We digress. So Mr. Strauss was a structuralist who was examining, at its basis, structures in society, how society works, how people organize and flow together. And what he found is that binaries are a common ground that unite humanity, which sounds bizarre because they're so polarized and seemingly clashing with each other, but that we, in our minds, are trained to see the universe in terms of binary opposites. And I don't know if anyone on this programming has ever done language learning, but one of the things that they tell you to do when you're doing language learning is to always learn the binary opposite. So you learn one word, and then they say, what's the opposite word? Okay, it's this. It's so that in your mind, you're always associating the two words together, even though they're so polar opposite. It's an interesting way of tricking the mind. But basically, he concluded that all of these words are symbols of man-made constructs, and that each binary opposition represents a juxtaposing of broader societal ideas. So when you look at something good versus evil, which is one of the most basic, watered-down, simple concepts, society has an idea of what constitutes good behavior. We have an idea of what constitutes law and order, of what is acceptable or classy behavior or mannered behavior versus what's evil and what's considered to be malicious, doing terrible things to another person. All of those notions are rooted in society, and we operate within those constructs. So we make sense of our world by juxtaposing them to create one concept, which is, my theory is, that's why a lot of these narratives arise. And that's why binary narratives are so common, because they're simple narratives, but they don't challenge us and they don't cause us to critically think enough or to look deeper into the subject matter being presented. Anyone who has grown up in a quote unquote Western society, which I guess we would define as the United States or Europe, with the Western notions of legalities, law, and religion, probably grew up predominantly under Christianity, with influences of Christianity in law and legal thought. What that comes from is, of course, the Bible. And this good versus evil construct is so ever present in the Bible through every chapter, both testaments. It's very addicting, and it's bled its way out into other stories within our culture that aren't necessarily religious stories or motivated by Christianity, but that construct stays with us somehow. So one way, and I'm sure this is quite the unpopular view for many people, but I see my own country now, the United States, as a large binary narrative. And the reason I say that is that we have these terms that are quite bothersome to a person like me. It's bothersome to a journalist. It's bothersome to anyone who likes to critically think because they're kind of damning terms. So these terms are the left and the right. And we have made our politics in the US a giant binary narrative. We have pitted both of these binaries against each other. Of course, if we go back to what Strauss said about how we're echoing society's constructs with this, yes, there are predominant views. The right has its own predominant views. The left has its own predominant views. There are, of course, moderates in between, including myself. But the narratives are so powerful in the simple term of the right and the left that immediately certain things start coming to your mind, do they not? Whenever I say the term the right, you immediately think opposed to women's rights, religious, trying to make laws based on religion, very capitalist, which may or may not be true about what it is that you're talking about. When you say terms like the left, you think about human rights and equality, women's rights. In some cases, unfortunately, cancel culture has been attributed a lot to the left. But my point is not to argue whether either of these sides is correct or the terms are correct. It's just to raise awareness of the fact that we have created in the US political establishment a binary narrative, a big one. And if I could encourage anyone listening, it would be to really dive into the issues being discussed and not read into these commentators who keep using the terms the right and the left, because oftentimes you'll find that the less educated, truly educated politicians or commentators are using these terms abundantly, whereas others that have more life experience and have more proven experience at doing what they're doing use these terms less and try to use more inclusive language. And that's exactly how I'll end this, is that using these terms is not inclusive. It does not bring people into a conversation. It calls people out. And that's a huge problem with binary narratives, is that they are a source of structuring people away from a conversation, putting them into a group, into a label, and getting them out of a conversation. It calls people out and doesn't call them in. And that's what bothers me about binary narratives personally. So those are the basics of binary narratives in their most simple form. Of course, Angela has some much deeper examples that she can go into, and I might point out that mythology represents some of our oldest notions of binary narratives. We're talking thousands of years back, these narratives started to emerge, which are even older than the Bible itself and older than some other religious texts as well. So, Ange, I'm turning it over to you.
Older than any religious texts, in fact. A lot of these narratives come from oral storytelling. But before we go into that, I wanted to say I really like how you use Claude Lévi-Strauss to kind of create space between the idea of a binary narrative and the idea of good and evil. Because I think that one of the problems with so many things today is that we really just associate binary narratives with the idea of good and evil. That's essentially all that they've become. The classic example being Democrats versus Republicans, like red versus blue, right versus left, right? When Claude Lévi-Strauss said those things about binary narratives, how our minds are designed this way, how they have almost a useful illustrative function for us to help us understand things, using the linguistic example that you used earlier. What it brought out to me was that is true. It's very helpful to know something and it's binary, right? Partly because when you know the two sides of something, you can start to get a sense of what the gradations are in between them, like what fits in between those bookends. And so I think that that's actually quite a helpful tool for humans who are storytellers. I think the difficulty with transforming binary narratives into pure good and evil narratives is that you take these bookends, which are perhaps designed to illustrate gradations in between, like to give you a way to organize very nuanced information, and you make them a team. You create a line in the middle. So all of a sudden, it doesn't actually matter what gradations exist between good over here and evil over here. As long as it's to the left or to the right of the line, it's good or it's evil. So you can throw it out or you can keep it, which makes it very complicated to, as you mentioned, have conversations, meet each other in the middle, have cohesion, because all of a sudden there are no gradations. One example that I think about a lot, or that I thought about a lot while you were talking, was, yeah, like there's this idea of like, in addition to law and order, there are also these ideas about like classiness. And it made me think about how quite often vulgarity, which is not evil in and of itself, I think that, I don't know, a serial killer who eats children is probably pretty evil. Vulgarity in comparison is probably a battle that I don't have to pick on that day. The serial killer is on the run. But vulgarity is often treated as a cancelable evil, as an actionable offense in culture, which is one of the issues that we have with things like freedom of speech, which, you know, like we can talk about the nuances of cancel culture another time. But what I wanted to go into, now that we're talking about the mythology portion of this topic, is that binary narratives in storytelling, particularly oral storytelling, shades of which we only have because they were written down. And again, there's a lot of conversation about what changed in humanity when literature became a thing. Like we really only know for a fact most things that happened because there's literature about it, and we're very dark in terms of what happened before that. But oral storytelling cultures were super sophisticated and by their nature quite mutable. They changed all the time based on the society. Literature-based cultures are a lot more fixed, and we are a literature-based culture. A lot of very old stories that we have for mythology, even if they were written down, were probably originally oral. We don't know what form they took really back then. We don't know how they could have evolved afterward, because once they're written down, they're kind of ossified. Quite often, what look like good and evil stories to us from our vantage point are actually binary narratives about archetypes. So a very classic binary narrative that we mistake for good and evil, but that is actually archetypal, is the war between the sun god and the snake. And the sun god is always killing the snake. So this happens in Sumer with Marduk, the sun god, who has to take power by killing the snake goddess Tiamat, who is one of the originating gods of all of the other gods. This is quite a common idea. In Egypt, Ta defeats the serpent Apophis, who is the nemesis of the sun god Ra. In Greece, classically, Apollo kills Python and then appropriates her powers of prophecy. That's how the Pythia is developed and becomes an Apollonian idea. In Aztec mythology, Huitzilopochtli, I totally just destroyed that, and I apologize. Huitzilopochtli, I just did it again. Also gets into some drama that involves the death of a mother snake figure that he has to defend. And that's sort of the legend about how he rises to power and why people have to keep issuing human sacrifices so that the sun can continuously defeat the powers of the moon. So this is a really old idea. There are a lot of ideas about what kind of story this is actually telling. Sun gods are quite often denoted with what we would today associate with the more patriarchal aspects of masculine identity. So the rule of law, like kingship, these are ideas that come from sun gods. In fact, when Ra kind of took over as the main god in Egypt around like 3000 to 2800 BC, that was when pharaohs started associating themselves with godhood. And you had a very, very different culture from what came before. A lot more patriarchal than what came before.
Okay. That's fascinating, Ange. I had no idea that serpent type or archetype was present in so much mythology, but you're right. Now that I look back, I do recall hearing about serpents a lot, particularly on our favorite example, the Bible, which begins with a temptation by a serpent. So I'm sure that has some significance.
I'm so glad you brought that up. So if the sun god represents this very specific, rigid, rules-oriented, masculine, authoritarian power, which that's also not to say that the masculine principle in and of itself is problematic. That's just what the sun god tends to be associated with in sort of like the collective unconscious. The serpent is associated with femininity, so cycles of life and death, the capacity to heal and harm. We're actually going to talk about this a little bit more in our next episode. But yeah, let's talk about the serpent in the Bible, because this is the moment where I would say for us, binary narratives go from being a series of stories about archetypes and what happens when archetypes encounter each other and take over each other, which happens all the time. That's part of the archetypal story. We're always kind of moving through different archetypes over the course of our lives, or even possibly our days. So what happens when we take the idea away that binary narratives are archetypal and make them about good and evil? So the Garden of Eden story, the classic Garden of Eden story, like the serpent tempts Eve into eating the apple from the tree of knowledge, which God said no about. And then God gets super mad and he evicts them from the garden. The Garden of Eden story resembles a series of stories that are typically called menstrual myths. So these are, and again, we're going to talk about this a lot more in the next episode. These were myths that were typically designed for older women to tell younger girls who were just entering into the state of adulthood. They usually involved a fruit, like a red one.
Of course, yes.
There's blood, there is death or sleep, something death-like, followed by a resurrection with a new body of knowledge. Like she literally gains knowledge by eating the apple. And this was supposed to initiate young girls into what happens when you enter your reproductive phase of life. Because when you enter the reproductive phase of life, obviously life and death are binaries that follow each other, and that's now part of your body, right? So in order for these stories to arrive at their crux, you need a character that's called an initiator. And this is a very complicated figure. Today, we would look at them as purely a villainous figure for reasons that we'll go into in a minute. But the serpent is a classic initiator figure because it is morally ambivalent. And more importantly, it represents the capacity to both heal and harm because of venom. Yeah. So the snake does its usual initiating thing, which is what always happens in menstrual myths, by encouraging her to eat the apple. But unlike other menstrual myths, in the biblical version of this myth, Eve is given knowledge, like she realizes she's naked, she shares the knowledge with her husband, he realizes it too, and they get punished. And God gets super upset, and he punishes Eve, Adam, and the serpent. It merits mention that at the time this story was written down, which was a little bit after the Babylonian captivity of the Jewish nations, this was an orally told story. So we don't really know how it sort of shifted and moved around, but we do know that for most of the sort of like the biblical periods that the Bible is talking about, there wasn't actually an idea of an existential evil that existed against God. And there was also not an idea that God was this sort of all-important figure. There did not exist any other gods. Like this is also a very new idea that comes after the Babylonian captivity. And there was also not an idea that God was specifically good or the best. This idea that the snake becomes a devil figure, even if that does happen progressively, the devil is also not really seen as particularly evil, even in going to, like, even when we enter medieval times, the devil was more like a troublemaker, a mercurial trickster figure. So sometimes he could be kind of a pain in the ass, but not really very harmful to you. And sometimes, he could actually possibly by accident do something quite good. In a lot of passages of the Bible, God even negotiates with what we consider to be the devil figure, which is Satan. That's a totally separate thing. Satan is not actually the devil, but we can talk about that another time. But in the time of the witch trials in Europe, there are a lot of things happening when the witch trials happen. This is around like the 16th century. This is the first moment that you actually have this idea that the devil is an ultimate existential evil and God is an ultimate existential good. So you're either on the side of God or you're on the side of evil. What was happening during that time? A scapegoat was being formed for lots of reasons, like this idea of like a particular kind of woman, right? Like that's why the witch trials were happening. And they were quickly associated with the devil to brand them as witches. So the devil had to be made the biggest existential evil. If you're associated with the devil, there's no way to save you. Like society just has to kind of throw you out or punish you. And what was happening sort of like in the larger arc of the story was the development of mercantilism and international markets. So that's like a much larger topic. But basically what we're seeing in this time that literally and quite directly precipitates the witch trials and this creation of the good versus evil binary narrative is the development of early imperialist capitalism as we know it and as we have continued it today. So there is also a huge systemic benefit to advancing the belief that binary narratives are not archetypal, which is cyclical. They're good versus evil, because then you have a zero-sum situation, which creates quite a nice basis for the kind of primitive accumulation that makes the belief in the benefits of capital possible.
Definitely. It's funny you brought that up because I was actually going to bring that up as well, that binary narratives are so prevalent in highly capitalist societies. It's like their darling. And there is an economist, Jeffrey Sachs, who has said economics doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. Somehow we've created that narrative in our head that in order for someone to be wealthy, someone has to be poor. Not true. Actually, there's enough to go around. There could be enough to go around if we had the will for there to be enough. So on that note, I digress because that could easily be an entire episode, but
it's true. A lot of these things could easily be an entire episode.
Which is why we're making this show.
Yeah, exactly. But to your point, the excuse that's usually made about this is it's survival of the fittest, which was our interpretation of Darwinism. To bring things back to actual Darwin was really frustrated with this interpretation. His attitude was, that is not at all what I was trying to say. It's not survival of the fittest. It's not a zero-sum game. It's adaptation. And as creatures adapt, the environment is also adapting. So even Darwin actually saw this as a collaborative thing. And then it was interpreted as a zero-sum, strongest always wins game.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a really good point.
All that to say that the good and evil dichotomy doesn't leave a lot of room for collaboration or cohesion. In fact, it's not designed to, which is one of the problems that we're having today. So it's a lot easier, at least for me, to think about the binary narratives that are so prevalent in our worlds in terms of archetypes. And in fact, there's a wonderful story in relation to this that's written down by Mary Louise von France in her book, Alchemy. So to return to this topic of sun gods and serpents, it's easy to sort of see that very ancient series of archetypal repetitions as the death of the goddess cultures, the death of feminine principles over, the sort of rule of law attitude by men to sort of see that as inevitable. But the story that she tells in Alchemy is that there was a moment in Egypt where Ra, the sun god, becomes ill. And Isis, his daughter, comes to him with a cure. And she says, I will give you this cure if you give me your secret name. Because at that time, there was the belief that gods and also men had secret names that they had to keep inside them that were the key to their power. Also a really rich idea that you see a lot in culture. And so Ra finally relents and he gives Isis his secret name. And instead of curing him, she, of course, seizes his power. And then the time of Isis begins. This story was used to illustrate the fact that this is a typical archetypal event. Like the masculine, it'll take over and then it eventually tires, and then it's time for the feminine or nature or chaos or whatever, you know, that other binary is to take over. And I think that this also illustrates one of the critical aspects of why binary narratives are so important. The idea of binaries generally are so important because you need an idea of binaries that are in collaboration and sometimes in conflict, but that are both necessary, one not ever more important than the other in the aggregate, even if sometimes it seems that way in time, in order to have equilibrium at all. Thank you all for joining us today. Hope you really liked today's show. And if you did, please feel free to share it, subscribe, and definitely join us for the next episode, which will be on boogeymen. Yay!
Everyone loves boogeymen, especially when they're narratives. And if you don't know what that is, you'll have to tune in.